Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku took over Hydra and rebuilt it as a hero organization. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The air in Nizudafa tasted of ozone, pulverized concrete, and fear. It was a cocktail Izuka Midoriya had become far too familiar with. Green lightning, the incandescent rage of one for all, crackled around him, tracing the powerful lines of his muscles beneath the tattered remains of his gamma costume. The pavement groaned under his feet, a web of fractures spreading from the soles of his reinforced boots with every slight shift in his weight. The battle had been raging for 47 minutes. He knew because his internal clock, a frantic metronome of analysis and reaction honed by countless life-or-death struggles, was ticking away with unnerving precision. "Deku, on your left!" The voice, strained and sharp, was Kyokajiro's, broadcast directly into his ear via his comms. He didn't need to look. He pivoted, the motion fluid and explosive. A rogue slab of rebar, launched like a javelin by the villain's chaotic power, was hurtling towards a family cowering behind a half-demolished bus stop. Float. The quirk of Nana Shimura engaged, lifting him inches off the ground. It was just enough. He swung his leg in a wide, powerful arc. Manchester smash! His foot connected with the steel rod. The impact was a deafening clang that echoed through the street, and the rebar, now bent into a useless V-shape, was blasted harmlessly into the sky. He landed with a soft thud, the soles of his boots absorbing the impact, his eyes already scanning for the next threat. The source of the chaos was a new face in the League of Villains' ever-expanding roster of nihilists. He called himself Vortex, a man in a form-fitting black suit covered in swirling, hypnotic patterns. His quirk, which the heroes had terrifyingly dubbed Singularity, was a nightmare made manifest. He didn't create explosions or project energy. He tore holes in the very fabric of reality. These were not simple portals. They were shimmering, oil-slick wounds in the world, apertures of non-space that pulled at light, sound, and matter with an insatiable hunger. They would appear without warning, on the side of a skyscraper, in the middle of an intersection, in the air itself, and begin to feed. "His pattern is getting more erratic," shouted a gravelly voice over the comms, punctuated by the sound of capturing weapon activating. "Mr. Aizawa. He's not aiming, he's just trying to cause as much collateral damage as possible. Containment is failing." Deku gritted his teeth, feeling the familiar phantom pains ache in his arms. He was holding one for all at a stable 45%, but the prolonged use was like running a marathon at a dead sprint. Every muscle fiber screamed in protest. He spotted Vortex again, perched atop a listing traffic light, his arms spread wide as if conducting a symphony of destruction. A new singularity, larger than any before, was shimmering into existence in the middle of the plaza. It distorted the world around it, bending the lines of buildings and stretching the screams of the terrified into long, unnatural wails. "I am the endpoint!" Vortex shrieked, his voice unnaturally clear amidst the din. "The beautiful, final silence! Why do you heroes insist on delaying the inevitable?" Deku's eyes widened in horror. In the path of the expanding anomaly, not 30 feet from its edge, stood Mr. Aizawa, his capture weapon wrapped around a struggling bystander he was pulling to safety. And next to him, her small hand clutching his leg, was Eri. Her silver hair was unmistakable. Her red eyes, wide with a terror that ripped a hole in Deku's own heart, were fixed on the swirling void. They must have been on a supervised outing, a small step towards a normal life, when hell had broken loose. The pull of the singularity intensified. Loose debris, papers, pebbles, a discarded hero merchandise cap, began to slide then stream towards it. A car with its alarm blaring screeched as it was dragged sideways, its tires leaving gouges in the asphalt. Aizawa, his own quirk useless against Vortex who was keeping his eyes shielded, was struggling to maintain his footing while pulling the civilian. He wouldn't be able to get himself and Eri clear in time. Time seemed to slow down. Deku saw it all with horrifying clarity. The infinitesimal widening of the vortex. The panicked look on Aizawa's face as he realized his predicament, and Eri, frozen, her gaze locked on the shimmering distortion that promised only oblivion. The vestiges within him stirred. A chorus of voices, not in words, but in pure, driving intent. Protect. Save. Go. He didn't think. He acted. F.A. Gene. The kinetic energy he'd been building in his legs released in a single, explosive burst. The ground beneath him shattered into a crater as he launched himself forward. Float. He was airborne, a green comet streaking across the ruined plaza. Black whip. Tendrils of dark energy erupted from his arms, not to attack, but to anchor. They shot out, wrapping around the base of a lamppost and the corner of a solid building, creating a V-shaped lifeline behind him. He was a projectile, his target not the villain, but the little girl who represented the very reason he fought. The air screamed past his ears. The pull from the singularity was immense now, a physical hand yanking at his very being, trying to unspool him into atoms. He reached them in a fraction of a second. "Mr. Aizawa! Get clear!" he roared, his voice barely audible over the vortex's grating hum. He didn't wait for a response. He angled his body, coming in at a low trajectory. His arms wrapped around Aries' small, trembling frame. She let out a tiny gasp, her face burying itself in the tattered fabric of his suit. For a single, fleeting moment he felt a sense of profound peace. He had her. She was safe. With the last of his momentum, he planted his feet and pushed. Not a smash. A shove. A desperate, heroic shove that sent both Aizawa and the civilian stumbling clear of the immediate danger zone. But his anchors, the tendrils of Black Whip, were straining. The lamppost groaned, bending at a sickening angle. The corner of the building he was attached to began to crumble, shedding dust and concrete. The pull was too strong. He felt his boots slide. First an inch. Then a foot. The ground was breaking apart beneath him, being devoured by the void. He looked down at Eri, still clutched in his arms. Her horn was glowing faintly, but her quirk was one of life, of rewinding. It had no power over this kind of unlife. He had one last choice to make. A choice that wasn't a choice at all. He tightened his grip on her, spun his body around, and with every ounce of strength left in his being, he threw her. She flew through the air, a small, precious projectile, landing safely in the arms of her startled guardian. Deku looked back at her. Her terrified red eyes met his. He gave her the brightest, most reassuring smile he could muster, a smile he hoped looked just like All Might's. Then his anchor snapped. The world dissolved. The pull was absolute. He felt a sensation not of movement, but of being fundamentally undone. His body stretched like taffy. The green lightning of One for All flared wildly, a dying star fighting against the gravity of a black hole. His senses overloaded. He saw colors that had no names, heard sounds that were paradoxes, felt his own existence fraying at the edges. His last coherent thought was not of fear, but of a quiet, resolute finality. Everyone is safe. Then, Izuku Midoriya, the ninth holder of One for All, was gone. Pain was the first architect of his new reality. It built a foundation of throbbing agony in his head, constructed walls of fire along his limbs from the backlash of his final power surge, and finished with a roof of deep, cellular exhaustion. Consciousness returned not as a gentle dawn, but as a rusty, groaning gate being forced open. The second architect was the smell. It was a putrid symphony of damp decay, rotting garbage, and something vaguely like stale beer. It was the smell of neglect, a stark contrast to the sterile scent of Recovery Girl's office or the clean, metallic smell of a battlefield. He cracked an eye open. The world was a blurry mess of dark, wet brick and flickering neon. He was slumped against a wall in a narrow alley, half sprawled in a puddle of grimy rainwater. His costume was in tatters, the armored plates cracked and the fabric shredded in places, exposing raw, bruised skin beneath. His mask was gone. One of his gloves was missing, revealing a hand trembling with strain. He pushed himself up, his muscles screaming. A groan escaped his lips, low and guttural. "Where?" he mumbled, his throat as dry as sandpaper. The sounds were wrong. The distant wail of a siren was a different pitch, a two-tone shriek instead of the familiar Japanese warble. The cacophony of the city was a low, constant rumble, underscored by the rapid-fire cadence of a language he recognized but was not used to hearing exclusively, English. He stumbled out of the alley, leaning heavily against the brick wall for support. He emerged onto a bustling street, and the sensory assault was immediate. Towering buildings of glass and steel pierced a sky choked with a hazy, gray light. Yellow taxicabs, boxier and more aggressive than the ones in Japan, swarmed the streets like angry hornets. The people were a rushing, indifferent river of faces of every creed and color, their voices a multi-layered babble of English. This was not Musitifu. This was not even Japan. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at the edges of his exhaustion. Okay, Midoriya. Analyze. Don't panic. He mimicked his mentor's voice in his head, a desperate attempt to impose order on the chaos. Where am I? Some kind of villain quirk? A transportation quirk? He spotted a newspaper stand, one of the few analog holdouts in a digital world. With trembling fingers, he fumbled in a pocket that was miraculously intact, and pulled out a few crumpled yen coins. The vendor, a portly man with a grizzled beard, gave him a strange look, both at the bizarre, tattered green suit and the foreign currency. Sorry, kid, the man grunted, gesturing to the coins. No idea what that is. Just take one, you look like you've been through the ringer. Deku nodded his thanks, his voice failing him. He grabbed the top paper. The masthead read the New York Times. New York? America? It was possible. A transportation quirk could have thrown him across the globe. Disorienting, but not impossible. He scanned the headlines, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Stark Expo promises a better tomorrow. SHIELD denies involvement in Sokovian incident. Remembering the Battle of New York, a city reborn from the ashes of alien invasion, his blood ran cold. Stark? SHIELD? Alien invasion? He frantically searched the page for familiar names. Endeavor. Hawks. Best Jeanist. The top 10 hero rankings. Anything. There was nothing. No mention of heroes. No mention of quirks. The entire cultural and social landscape that had defined his existence was absent. He looked at the date, printed neatly at the top right. It was the same day, the same year. He hadn't traveled in time. He had traveled sideways. The newspaper slipped from his numb fingers, fluttering to the grimy sidewalk. The reality of his situation crashed down on him with the force of a Detroit smash. He was alone. He was in a world that was not his own, a world with its own history, its own tragedies, and its own protectors. A world without All Might. Without his mother. Without Uraraka Ida Kaken. A wave of vertigo washed over him. He staggered back, pressing his shoulders against the cold glass of a storefront window to keep from collapsing. His breath came in ragged, panicked gasps. He was a hero without a home. A savior stranded in a land he didn't know how to save. No. Stop. He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing the tidal wave of despair back. Panicking won't help. It won't get me home. I'm a hero. I need to act like one. First, information. Then, a plan. His resolve was interrupted by a sudden, jarring sound. Not the normal city din, but the high-pitched squeal of tires and the deep, resonant thump of something heavy and armored coming to a sudden stop. Up the street, chaos erupted. People screamed and scattered. A vehicle, matte black and brutally angular like some kind of futuristic APC, had plowed through a line of parked cars and screeched to a halt in front of a bank. It looked like something from a war zone, not a city street. Doors hissed open and 4 figures emerged. They were clad in tactical gear, their faces obscured by ballistic masks, and they carried rifles that hummed with a low, menacing energy. Robbery. Even in another dimension, some things were depressingly universal. Deku's exhaustion and despair were instantly incinerated by the fire of his heroic instinct. It was a Pavlovian response. See trouble, see people in danger, and every fiber of his being screamed one word: act. He didn't know the laws here. He didn't know who the authorities were. He didn't even know if using his power was legal. He only knew that people were frozen in fear, and armed thugs were about to inflict harm. One of the robbers fired his rifle at the bank's reinforced glass doors. A bolt of crackling blue energy slammed into the entrance, blowing it inward in a shower of melted glass and twisted metal. That was all he needed to see. He pushed off the window. His body still ached, his reserves were low, but One for All answered his call. The familiar green lightning flickered to life around him, fainter than usual but still thrumming with power. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice rough but carrying over the panic screams. "Stop what you're doing!" The four robbers turned, their faceless masks all swiveling to face him. They saw a teenager in a shredded green costume, glowing with a faint emerald light. One of them laughed, a distorted, metallic sound coming from his masked speaker. "Look what we got here," the robber sneered. "Some kid in pajamas thinks he's a hero. Go home, kid, before you get hurt." He raised his energy rifle. Deku didn't hesitate. One for all, 20%. It was a conservative number, a fraction of his full strength, but he didn't know the durability of people in this world. He wanted to disable, not obliterate. He crouched low and flicked his middle finger, a motion as natural to him as breathing. Delaware smash! It wasn't the air bullet he was aiming for. It was the shockwave. The air in front of him compressed, and then exploded outwards in a visible, concussive blast. The robber who had laughed was sent flying, his rifle spinning away as he crashed into the side of the armored truck with a sickening crunch. The other three were staggered, knocked off their feet by the sheer force of the air pressure. The windows of the surrounding storefronts didn't just crack, they shattered, raining down like sharp, glittering hail. The street fell silent. The fleeing civilians, the robbers, the drivers stuck in traffic, everyone stared in stunned disbelief at the kid in the green suit. Deku ignored them. He shot forward, a green blur of motion. He snatched the rifles from the two nearest dazed robbers, bent the barrels into twisted knots of metal with his bare hands, and tossed them aside. The third, recovering his senses, tried to swing at him with the butt of his gun. Deku sidestepped, grabbed the man's arm, and applied a simple, controlled pressure to his elbow joint. There was a wet pop and the man screamed, collapsing to the ground and clutching his dislocated arm. It was over in 5 seconds. 4 heavily armed, high-tech robbers disabled. Minimal force. No casualties. A perfect textbook takedown. He stood up, breathing a little heavily, the green lightning fading around him. He looked at the shocked faces of the civilians. In his world, there would be cheers, relief, maybe even a news crew by now. Here, there was only fear. They weren't looking at him like a savior. They were looking at him like he was a bomb that had just gone off. A cold prickle ran down his spine. It was the feeling of being watched. Not by the crowd. This was different. It was a focused, predatory gaze. From the shadows of alleys, from unmarked black sedans that had pulled silently to the curb, they emerged. They were soldiers. At least a dozen of them. They wore sleek, black tactical uniforms devoid of any identifying marks save for one subtle insignia on their shoulders, a grotesque skull with writhing tentacles erupting from it. They moved with an eerie, synchronized silence, their faces hidden by emotionless black helmets. They fanned out, forming a perfect perimeter, their weapons raised. But they weren't rifles. They were strange, dish-like devices and high-tech prods. Deku's danger sense, the gift from the fourth user, screamed a silent alarm in his mind. These weren't police. They weren't military. They were something else. Something older and more sinister. "Stand down," one of them said, his voice flat and distorted by a vocalizer. "Surrender the asset." Asset? Were they talking about him? "I'm not an asset," Deku said, his stance shifting into a low fighting crouch. "And I'm not surrendering to people who look like villains." The lead soldier didn't respond. He simply gave a curt nod. 2 of the soldiers pointed their dish-like devices at him, and activated them. A low hum filled the air, rapidly escalating into a high-frequency shriek that was almost beyond the range of hearing. It felt like a drill boring into his skull. The world tilted violently. Nausea roiled in his stomach. The green lightning of One for All sputtered and died, the connection to his power suddenly feeling weak and frayed. It was a sonic dampener, specifically tuned to disrupt his unique biology. They had analyzed his power from his single attack and deployed a countermeasure in seconds. There, efficient, was his last analytical thought before his body began to fail him. He staggered, one knee hitting the pavement. He tried to summon Black Whip, to pull himself away, but his focus was shattered. The tendrils flickered into existence for a bare moment before dissolving into black smoke. He grit his teeth, fighting against the disorienting wave of sound. He was not going down this easily. With a roar of effort, he pushed himself back to his feet, ready to charge, ready to fight through the pain. That's when the other soldiers moved in. The tips of their prods glowed with blue energy. 3 of them jabbed him at once, in his back, his shoulder, his leg. It wasn't like Kaminari's electricity. This was 1,000 times worse. It was a targeted neuroelectric shock, designed to overload a powered individual's nervous system. His entire body locked up. Every muscle seized in agonizing paralysis. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even cry out. He fell forward, his body stiff as a board, and hit the pavement with a loud, unceremonious thud. His vision swam. The world was a kaleidoscope of blurry lights and dark shapes. The soldiers closed in around him, their black boots surrounding his field of vision. One of them knelt down, a hypodermic needle in his gloved hand. He felt a sharp prick in his neck, and a cold liquid began to spread through his veins, a chemical blanket smothering the last embers of his consciousness. As his eyelids grew heavy, his gaze fell on the shoulder patch of the soldier kneeling over him. The symbol swam into focus for one last, terrifying moment. The skull. The writhing tentacles. It was a symbol he had never seen before, but it radiated an ancient, undiluted malice. It spoke of deep roots and shadowed histories, of a belief that humanity was a thing to be controlled, not saved. It was the sigil of a serpent that had coiled itself around the heart of this new world. The soldier leaned in close, his helmet's black visor reflecting Deku's own fading eyes. A single, chilling whisper reached his ears, a phrase that would become the anthem of his coming nightmare. Hail Hydra! And then the world, in all its terrifying newness, faded to black. The serpent's coil had tightened. The hero had fallen. Consciousness returned like a faulty fluorescent light, flickering on and off in agonizing bursts. The first time, it was a sliver of awareness, a profound cold that seemed to seep into his bones and a low, rhythmic beeping that was the only sound in a universe of silence. Then, darkness again. The second time, the beeping was clearer, and he could feel the unnatural stillness of his own body. He was lying on his back, his limbs held in a perfect, cruciform position. He tried to move a finger and felt an unyielding resistance, not the rough chafe of rope or the cold bite of metal cuffs, but something smooth, wide, and utterly immovable. The third time his eyes fluttered open, the light was the first true assault. It was a sterile, shadowless white, pouring down from luminous panels in the ceiling. It was the kind of light that bleached all color, all warmth, all hope. He blinked, pupils contracting to pinpricks, and the world slowly swam into focus. He was on a table, more like an altar of medical science, in the center of a vast circular room. The walls were a gleaming, obsidian black material that seemed to drink the light. Consoles, monitors, and complex machinery were embedded directly into them, forming a seamless ring of technological surveillance. Wires and transparent tubes snaked from the machines towards him, some attached to sensors on his chest and temples, others feeding clear and colored liquids into 4 drips plunged into his arms. His restraints were as advanced as the room. They weren't straps but wide, semi-translucent bands of a polymer composite that covered his biceps, forearms, thighs, and shins. Thin, blue lines of light pulsed within them, a visual representation of the energy field that likely kept him both pinned and powerless. This was not a prison cell. It was a specimen slide, and he was the organism under the microscope. A figure moved in his peripheral vision. A woman. She was tall and slender, her posture as sharp and unforgiving as the cut of her pristine white lab coat. Her dark hair was pulled back into a severe bun, not a single strand daring to escape its disciplined hold. Her face was a study in sharp angles, high cheekbones, a pointed chin, and thin lips pressed into a neutral line. But it was her eyes that held him. They were a pale, intelligent gray, and as they scanned the data scrolling across a floating holographic display near his head, they held no malice, no glee, no anger. They held only a chilling, professional curiosity. It was the look a biologist might give a rare, fascinating, and potentially dangerous new species of insect. Subject is conscious, she stated, her voice calm and clipped, resonating with clinical authority in the silent room. Vitals are stable. Metabolic rate remains anomalous. approximately 500% above a standard human baseline, even in a sedated state. She made a minute adjustment on her display with a flick of her fingers. Deku felt a slight tingling sensation spread from the restraints, and the ghost of One for All's power, a faint warmth he could always feel humming deep within him, dimmed even further. The cellular regeneration is remarkable, she continued, more to herself than to anyone else. She gestured to a magnified image on the screen, a microscopic view of his own tissue. Lacerations and severe contusions sustained during capture have healed by over 90% in less than 8 hours. No scarring. The cellular structure is flawless. It's as if the super soldier serum's regenerative properties were not just perfected but made an inherent biological function. Super soldier serum? The name was unfamiliar, but the context was clear. They didn't understand what a quirk was. They saw One for All not as a unique, metaphysical power passed down through generations, but as a biological enhancement, something they could study, quantify, and most terrifyingly, replicate. This woman, the clear leader of this scientific endeavor, was Dr. Celine Ryder. He didn't know her name yet, but he knew her type. She was driven by the pursuit of knowledge above all else. Ideology was a secondary concern to the beauty of a perfect data set. In her eyes, he wasn't Izuku Midoriya, a hero in training. He was Project Chimera's most promising specimen. As they began their work, a team of junior scientists and technicians filtering into the room with silent efficiency, Deku did what he always did when faced with an overwhelming threat. He shut down his panic and turned on his brain. His body was a prisoner, but his mind was free. And his mind was a weapon they hadn't yet thought to shackle. Analysis in reverse, he thought, the phrase a spark of defiance in the cold prison of his mind. They are studying me. So I will study them. He started with the obvious. The guards. They patrolled the perimeter of the circular lab in two-man teams. Their footfalls were silent, their movements economical. He began timing their rotations. A new team entered through the single, massive door every 12 minutes, a seamless transition. They carried the same sonic dampeners and neuroelectric prods they had used to capture him. Their armor was light but comprehensive, suggesting it was designed to stop projectiles and blunt force trauma. Their discipline was absolute. These were the true believers. Then he studied the scientific staff. Unlike the guards, they were not a monolith. Dr. Ryder was the undisputed queen of this hive. Her commands followed without question. But the younger technicians and assistants were different. He watched their interactions from the corner of his eye. He saw the subtle slump in a young man's shoulders when a superior spoke harshly to him. He heard the hushed whispers between two women huddled over a console, their conversation quickly ceasing when a guard passed by. He saw the way their hands trembled ever so slightly as they handled volatile energy samples. This wasn't the fanaticism of the soldiers. It was the anxiety of employees in a high-stress, high-stakes job. Some were likely here for the paycheck, others perhaps coerced, trapped by skills that made them too valuable to let go. This was the first fracture in Hydra's monolithic armor. He analyzed the technology. The door was a marvel of engineering, a circular iris that dilated open and shut with barely a whisper. No visible hinges, no conventional lock. It was likely magnetic or pressure-sealed. The restraints pulsed with energy, clearly the source of the dampening field. If he could disrupt their power source, even for a moment. The thought was a seed. He filed it away. They subjected him to a battery of tests. Scanners bathed him in strange energies, mapping his body down to the molecular level. Automated arms drew blood, took tissue samples, measured his neuroresponses to various stimuli. Through it all, he remained outwardly placeless, his face a mask of exhausted neutrality. But inside, his mind was a whirlwind of activity, memorizing every procedure, every machine's function, every word spoken. The biokinetic energy cascade is self-generating, a technician reported, his voice tinged with awe. It doesn't seem to have an external power source. It's like every cell in his body is a miniature power plant. Focus on the genetic markers, Jonas, Dr. Ryder corrected, her tone sharp. We are not here to write poetry. We are here to reverse engineer a weapon. Find the sequence that allows for this energy production. We will isolate it. We will synthesize it. They were searching for the one for all gene. A fool's errand. It gave Deku a sliver of hope. They were on the wrong path, looking for a physical key to a spiritual lock. One for all wasn't just power, it was will. It was the collective spirit of 8 heroes who had come before him. That was something their scanners and samplers could never detect. The hours bled into one another, marked only by the shift changes of the guards. Then, the routine was broken. The iris door dilated, and a different kind of authority entered the room. The man was tall and impeccably dressed in a tailored dark gray suit that seemed more like a uniform. He had a severe, aristocratic face, with slicked back gray hair and a scar that cut through one eyebrow. But the most striking feature was the monocle pressed into his right eye socket. It glinted under the laboratory lights, a cold circle of glass that seemed to magnify the intensity and cruelty of his gaze. The air in the room instantly became colder, heavier. Even the formidable Dr. Ryder seemed to shrink slightly, her posture becoming one of deferential respect. Baron von Strucker, she said, her voice losing its edge of command. An unexpected visit. The progress on Project Chimera is of paramount importance, Dr. Strucker said, his voice a low, cultured rumble with a distinct German accent. He walked slowly around Deku's table, his polished shoes making no sound on the floor. He looked down at Deku not as a scientist looks at a specimen, but as a predator looks at its captured prey. And this is the source material, Strucker mused, a thin, cruel smile touching his lips. Remarkable. To think, all of Zola's research, all our attempts to replicate Erskine's serum, and the answer simply falls from the sky into our laps. He leaned in close, his face just inches from Deku's. The smell of expensive cologne and sterile power washed over him. You have the power of a god, boy. A power to command, to shape the world as you see fit. And you wasted playing the part of a childish hero, protecting the weak and the unworthy. The interrogation had begun. It wasn't a physical one. It was a battle for his soul. Deku met his gaze, refusing to show fear. Saving people is never a waste, he said, his voice hoarse but steady. Strucker chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. Saving them? You delay their inevitable fate. Humanity is a chaotic, self-destructive species. They crave order. They cry out for a firm hand to guide them, to tell them what to think and what to do. They do not want the freedom you so naively champion. They want the peace of servitude. That is the truth Hydra has always understood. He began to pace. We will take this power from you. We will create an army of superiors, an army that will finally bring order to this chaotic world. Your legacy will be the foundation of a new age. You should be proud. You will be the father of a perfect, orderly world. Deku felt a surge of indignation that momentarily overpowered his exhaustion. This was the same twisted logic he'd heard from Shigaraki, from All for One. The belief that their will was superior, that their vision of order justified any atrocity. You're wrong, Deku said, his voice gaining strength. You talk about order, but all you bring is fear. True strength, the kind of strength I believe in, isn't about ruling over people. It's about lifting them up. It's about giving them the hope and the safety to stand on their own. A hero doesn't put the world in chains. A hero helps them break them. He thought of All Might, standing tall amidst the rubble, his smile a beacon that told everyone, it's fine now. Why? Because I am here. That smile wasn't about power or control. It was a promise of safety. The strongest person isn't the one who can knock everyone down, Deku continued, his words ringing with a conviction that filled the sterile room. It's the one who can help everyone else get back up. That's what you'll never understand. Strucker's smile tightened. The boy was not breaking, he was preaching. Such sentimental nonsense. The ramblings of a child who has never known true power, even as he wields it. We will correct that ignorance. He turned to Dr. Ryder. The doctor tells me you heal at an incredible rate. Perhaps we should test the limits of that regeneration. A little pain might broaden your perspective. The threat hung in the air, cold and sharp. But as Strucker spoke, Deku noticed something. Dr. Ryder's expression had changed. As Strucker launched into his ideological tirade about order and control, a flicker of something had crossed her face. It wasn't agreement. It was impatience. Strucker's monologue was inefficient. It was dogma, not data. And when Deku had responded, she hadn't looked at him with contempt, but with that same intense, analytical curiosity. His unwavering conviction, his absolute moral certainty. It was another anomaly, a psychological variable she couldn't quantify. It fascinated her as much as his biology. The seed of doubt, which had been a mere possibility, began to sprout in the fertile ground of her scientific mind. Strucker, having delivered his pronouncement, turned and swept from the room, his guards falling into formation behind him. The oppressive atmosphere lifted slightly, but the tension remained. Dr. Ryder stood silently for a long moment, her gaze distant. Then she turned back to her console. "Resume the scans," she ordered, her voice back to its clipped, professional tone. "I want a full neural map. I want to understand the source of his psychological resilience." The day wore on. The routine of tests and scans continued. Deku, ever watchful, continued his own analysis. He had identified the key players. Strucker, the fanatical ideologue. Ryder, the pragmatic scientist. And the lower ranks, a mix of true believers and reluctant employees. He knew now that his only path forward was to widen those fractures. To turn the pragmatists against the fanatics. His chance came sooner than he could have ever hoped. It started with a low, pulsating hum from a section of the lab he hadn't been able to see clearly. It was an energy containment unit, and based on the hushed, anxious tones of the technicians working on it, the experiment was unstable. They were trying to energize a small, metallic object, something that glowed with a faint blue light. A piece of alien technology, perhaps from the Battle of New York he'd read about. Power fluctuations are off the charts. One technician yelled. "The magnetic containment is failing. Shut it down." Another voice commanded. "I can't. The feedback loop is preventing a manual override." Dr. Ryder strode towards the station, her face a mask of intense concentration. "Evacuate the non-essential personnel. Seal the quadrant." Alarms blared, bathing the lab in a pulsating red light. The technicians began to back away, their faces pale with fear. But one of them, a young man Deku had noticed earlier, clumsy, nervous, clearly new, tripped over a power conduit as he scrambled back. He fell hard, his head striking the floor. His name was Leo. Deku had heard another tech call him. Leo lay dazed on the floor, directly in the path of the overheating containment unit. Above him, a heavy diagnostic scanner array attached to the ceiling began to shudder violently, its mounting bolts groaning under the strain of the energy waves. Sparks rained down from the machine. One of the main bolts sheared off with a loud crack, and the multi-ton piece of equipment tilted precariously, threatening to fall and crush the young man below. Chaos erupted. People screamed and ran for the door. The guards, trained for combat, not industrial accidents, instinctively took up defensive positions, protecting the exit and Dr. Ryder. No one moved toward Leo. He was an acceptable loss. In that instant, Deku saw not a Hydra technician, but a person in danger. He saw a reflection of every civilian he had ever sworn to protect. The vestiges of one for all roared to life within him. This was not a request. It was a command. Save him. He focused all his will, all his energy, on the restraint on his right arm. He couldn't use a smash. The force would be too broad, too destructive, and would likely trigger lethal countermeasures from the guards. He needed precision. He needed control. F.A. Gene, the quirk of the second user. He gathered the kinetic energy he had been subconsciously storing for hours, every twitch, every strained muscle, every beat of his heart, and focused it into a single point on the inside of his bicep. He unleashed it in one silent, explosive burst. There was a sharp crack, not of bone, but of polymer. It was no louder than a drop tool, lost in the cacophony of the alarms. A hairline fracture appeared on the restraint. It was still holding, but its integrity was compromised. The blue light within it flickered erratically. It was enough. He pulled. The damaged restraint shattered, freeing his right arm. The sudden freedom sent a jolt of pain up his shoulder, but he ignored it. The scanner array above Leo broke free from its final bolt. It began to fall. Black whip! A torrent of black energy tendrils erupted from his newly freed arm. They didn't lash out at the guards. They didn't claw for the door. They shot upwards and forwards, forming a thick, lattice-like shield directly over the fallen lab assistant. The massive piece of machinery slammed into the black whip shield with a deafening shriek of protesting metal. The impact was immense. The force of it traveled down the tendrils and into Deku's body. He roared, every muscle straining, the veins in his neck and forehead standing out in stark relief. His body was lifted off the table, held only by the remaining restraints. The strain on his arm was agonizing, the feeling of tearing muscles and grinding bone a familiar torment, but the shield held. The scanner, its momentum spent, hung suspended in the web of black energy, mere feet above Leo's head. Silence. The alarms died down as some other system finally engaged, shutting down the runaway experiment. The pulsating red lights ceased, replaced by the stark, clinical white from before. In the sudden, ringing quiet, everyone stared. The fleeing technicians, the hardened guards, Dr. Ryder, all frozen, their eyes wide with disbelief. They stared at the prisoner, still strapped to the table, his one free arm outstretched, trembling violently from the strain. They stared at the web of impossible black energy holding a ton of metal aloft. And they stared at the young man, Leo, who was now scrambling to his feet, looking up at the green-suited figure who had just saved his life with a mixture of terror and absolute, undiluted awe. The guards recovered first, raising their sonic dampeners. No, a voice cut through the tension, sharp and absolute. It was Dr. Ryder. She walked forward slowly, her gray eyes no longer looking at a specimen, but at the boy on the table. She looked at his face, contorted in pain but also fierce with determination. She looked at the shield of Black Whip, a power he had manifested not to escape, but to protect one of his own captors. She looked at Leo, who was unharmed. Her entire scientific model for this subject had been built on the premise that he was a biological anomaly, a living weapon to be dissected and replicated. But this was not the action of a weapon. A weapon does not choose to suffer to protect another. This was an act of will. An act of principle. An act of heroism, performed under the most extreme duress imaginable. It was a data point that shattered her entire hypothesis. She stopped beside Deku's table. He let the Black Whip shield dissipate, the scanner array crashing to the floor with a final, echoing boom, its potential for harm now gone. His arm fell limp, and he gasped for breath, his body trembling with the aftershock of the effort. A guard moved forward, a new, heavier restraint in his hand. Wait, Ryder commanded again. She looked down at Deku, her expression unreadable. For the first time, she addressed him not as the subject, but as a person. Why? She asked, her voice quiet, almost a whisper. He is one of us. Your enemy. Why would you save him? Deku lifted his head, his green eyes, blazing with an exhausted but unbreakable light, meeting hers. Because he was in trouble, he gasped out, each word an effort. That's the only reason a hero ever needs. The words, so simple, so naive, so utterly contrary to the entire philosophy of Hydra, hung in the air. The guard hesitated, looking to Ryder for confirmation. Leo stared at Deku, his mouth agape. Dr. Celine Ryder, the pragmatic scientist, the logical mind, looked at the boy who bled for his enemies. The seed of doubt that had been planted during the interrogation had, in this single, selfless act, blossomed. For the first time, she considered a radical, illogical, and dangerous new possibility. Perhaps their greatest asset wasn't the power coursing through the boy's veins. Perhaps it was the boy himself. Secure him, she finally ordered the guard, her voice regaining its composure. And get a medical team for his arm. As the guards moved in, reattaching a new, more powerful restraint to his arm, Deku let his head fall back against the table. He had failed to escape. He was still a prisoner, more securely held than before. But as he looked at Dr. Ryder's retreating back, at the way she paused to check on the shaken Leo, he knew he had succeeded in a far more important mission. He had not broken their chains, but he had planted a question in the minds of his jailers. In the sterile, heartless laboratory of the serpent, a single, heroic act had introduced a variable they could never hope to control: hope. The analysis had been reversed. And the coup had just begun. The week following the lab incident was a study in controlled observation. Outwardly, nothing changed for Izuku Midoriya. He remained a specimen, strapped to his cold metal altar under the sterile, unending light. The shifts changed with the same unnerving punctuality. The hum of the machinery was a constant, monotonous drone, but beneath the surface, a tectonic shift had occurred. Dr. Ryder's visits became more frequent. Her official reason, logged meticulously in the base's records, was an intensified psychological evaluation to better understand the subject's anomalous motivational drivers. The guards accepted this. The doctor's whims were law within her domain, but the true purpose of these visits was far more seditious. Your heroic impulse is a psychological flaw, she would begin, her voice crisp and clinical for the benefit of any listening ears, as she adjusted a sensor on his temple, a martyrdom complex derived from deep-seated feelings of inadequacy. Then, she would lean closer, her fingers deftly keying a command into the small, handheld datapad she carried. For a period of exactly 60 seconds, a small icon on her screen would flash red, audio logging, offline. You analyze the guard rotations, she would murmur, her voice dropping to a near whisper. What else? The power grid, Deku would reply, his voice low and urgent, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. The main conduits run beneath the central corridor, but the secondary junction for this entire sector is behind a service panel in the West Wing lavatory. It's less guarded. A targeted surge there would knock out power to the labs and barracks C and D, but not the command center or the armory. It's a flaw in their tiered system. Insufficient, she'd counter, her eyes darting to the timer on her datapad. A power outage triggers a lockdown and an immediate alert to external command. It would bring Strucker's personal guard down on us within minutes. Not an outage, Deku would clarify, his mind racing. A disruption. You create a diagnostic feedback loop. It won't read as a failure, it will read as a system under maintenance. It buys us time. The 60 seconds would end. Audio logging, online, your obsession with self-sacrifice is inefficient and illogical, she'd state loudly, stepping back. We will need to run further cognitive tests. And so it went. In stolen, 60-second increments, over the course of 7 days, they built a conspiracy. Deku, with his unparalleled analytical mind, became the strategist. He had spent every waking moment not just observing, but deconstructing the facility around him. He mapped it in his mind, the airflow in the vents, the slight hesitation in a specific guard's step, the chatter he overheard about supply shipments, the schematics he glimpsed on unattended monitors. He built a three-dimensional blueprint of the base's operations, its security, and most importantly its soul. He presented his findings to Ryder not as a plea for freedom, but as a proposal for a hostile takeover. He appealed to the one thing he knew she valued above all else, efficiency. Strucker is a fanatic, he argued during one of their clandestine 60-second meetings. His ideology is a relic. It's inefficient. It breeds paranoia and stifles innovation. The incident with Leo, that was a direct result of his dogma. Fear as a motivator leads to mistakes. It almost cost you your research, your lab, your life's work. He sees power as a sword to conquer. That's a finite goal. It ends in destruction, either his or the world's. Ryder's gray eyes remained fixed on his, her expression unreadable. And your alternative? She whispered, the seconds ticking away. I see power as a shield. A shield is adaptive. It can be used for defense, for containment, for rescue. Its applications are infinite. Under Strucker, you are building weapons for a war he is destined to lose. With me, you can build the future. Your research wouldn't be for destruction, but for preservation. For progress. True, lasting power isn't in ruling the world, Doctor. It's in ensuring it has a world left to rule. He saw the flicker in her eyes. He had framed it in her language. Preservation of the system. Infinite applications. Progress. He wasn't asking her to be a hero. He was offering her a promotion from chief weapons designer to a key architect of a new world order, one built on stability, not terror. His methods are archaic, she finally conceded, a monumental admission. His obsession with the Red Skull's legacy is a sentimental weakness. Then help me cut him out of the equation, Deku pressed. Like a tumor. For the good of the organism. The final piece of his plan was the most audacious. He wouldn't just escape. He wouldn't just fight his way out. he would seize control of the entire facility. He laid out the weak points in the chain of command, identifying the handful of fanatical officers who were Strucker's true power base. The rest, the majority, were cogs in the machine, disenfranchised soldiers, scientists under contract, technicians just doing a job. They were loyal to the paycheck and the authority, not the man. You show them a new authority, Deku explained, one that is stronger, more efficient, and offers them safety instead of suicide missions, and they will follow. People don't follow an idea. They follow a symbol of strength. On the 7th day, Dr. Ryder came for her final evaluation. She keyed the 60-second override. Baron von Strucker returns tonight, she said, her voice devoid of emotion. He is displeased with the lack of progress in replicating your abilities and intends to begin more aggressive forms of tissue extraction, torture. That's what she meant. The timeline had just been moved up. It was now or never. Tonight then, Deku said, his heart hammering against his ribs. The primary shift change. 2200 hours. The corridors are at their most congested. It's the perfect cover. Ryder looked at him, a long, searching gaze. She was weighing the variables, calculating the probability of success. It was a monumental gamble, betraying the organization that had defined her entire career for the absurd vision of a captive teenager from another world. At 2200 hours, she said, her voice a cold, hard whisper, I will be rerouting primary power to run a full diagnostic on the eastern sector's life support systems. The power draw will create a 2-minute window where the energy regulation for the containment cells, including this one, will need to be manually reset. During that window, the dampening fields will be offline. Audio logging, online. She straightened up. Subject's psychological state remains stubbornly resistant to conventional reprogramming. Further study is required. She turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing in the silence. But just before the iris door dilated open, she paused and spoke without looking back, her voice at its normal, clinical volume. Be efficient, subject. It was the starting gun. The hours leading up to 2200 hours were the longest of Deku's life. He lay on the table, forcing his breathing to remain slow and even, a stark contrast to the frantic symphony of his heart. He ran the plan over and over in his head, a complex dance of timing, power, and strategy. This wasn't a UE training exercise. There were no safety nets. Failure meant a fate worse than death, not just for him, but for Ryder and anyone else caught in the crossfire. The vestiges were a quiet, humming presence in the back of his mind. They weren't speaking, but he could feel their collective will, a reservoir of resolve he could draw upon. They had faced a tyrant before. They knew the cost of fighting for freedom. At 21:58, the 2 guards in the lab began their pre-shift change checks. They were relaxed, their movements casual. It was just another night. At exactly 2200 hours, the main lights in the lab flickered once. The constant, low hum of the dampening field faltered. The blue lines of light in Deku's restraint stuttered and died. For the first time in over a week, he could feel it. One for all, roaring back to life, flooding his system like a tidal wave. The power was intoxicating, a vibrant, crackling fire that chased the cold from his bones. The 2 guards noticed the flickering lights on the restraints. One of them tapped his Comm Lab 1 to control. We have a power fluctuation on the Chimera containment unit. Requesting tech support. He never finished the sentence. F.A. Jean. Deku released the kinetic energy he'd been building for hours in a single, silent burst. The remaining restraints, now just physical clamps without their energy fields, shattered into pieces. He was off the table in a fluid motion, landing silently on the polished floor. The 2 guards spun around, their eyes wide with shock, reaching for the prods on their belts. They were too slow. Deku moved like a phantom. 2 steps, and he was on them. It wasn't a smash. It was a precise, targeted attack. 2 swift chops to the base of their necks, delivered with just enough force to disrupt the nerve cluster and induce immediate unconsciousness. They crumpled to the floor without a sound. He took a deep breath, the green lightning of One for All now swirling around him, a cloak of controlled power. The first step was complete. He had 2 minutes. He ripped the IVs from his arms, ignoring the sting. His first objective, communications. He burst from the lab into the main corridor. As predicted, it was filled with personnel moving to and from their shifts. His sudden appearance, a figure of crackling green energy in a tattered costume, caused a moment of stunned silence, followed by mass panic. "It's the asset! He's loose!" Someone screamed. Alarms began to blare, but they were the internal klaxons, not the external alert. Ryder's gambit was holding. Deku ignored the fleeing technicians. He was a shark moving through a school of fish, his eyes locked on his prey. Ahead, 4 guards, members of Strucker's elite, were turning to engage him, raising their sonic dampeners. He didn't charge them head-on. He leapt, his feet striking the wall. Float activated, holding him horizontal for a split second as he pushed off, launching himself over their heads. Black whip! Tendrils of black energy shot from his arms, not at the guards, but at the ceiling conduits and support beams above them. He wrapped the tendrils around the guards, but not to crush them. He ensnared their limbs and weapons and, in one powerful heave, hoisted them into the air, leaving them dangling harmlessly, tangled in their own gear. He landed and sprinted down the corridor towards the communications hub. The door was reinforced steel. He didn't have time to find a keycard. One for all 30%. St. Louis smash! He focused his power into his leg and swung it in a devastating arc, smashing his foot directly into the door's locking mechanism. The metal screamed and buckled, the door flying off its hinges and crashing into the far wall of the comms room. The 2 operators inside barely had time to look up before he was on them, disabling them with the same swift, non-lethal efficiency as the lab guards. He slammed his hand down on the master control panel, severing all external communication. The base was now an island. His island. Next, the armory. He didn't need to go inside. He just needed to seal it. He raced to the location, a massive vault door guarded by an automated turret. The turret swiveled to track him, its laser sight painting a red dot on his chest. Shoot style, Air Force. He fired off 4 consecutive air bullets, not at the turret itself, but at its ceiling mount. The bolts of pressurized air struck with concussive force, shearing the mount from the ceiling. The turret crashed to the ground in a shower of sparks. Before the 2 guards at the door could react, he fired another blast at the control panel next to the vault, shattering it into a million pieces. The armory was locked down, its deadliest weapons inaccessible. His 2-minute window was long gone, but he now controlled the flow of battle. The internal comms crackled to life, a panicked officer shouting orders. "All units, converge on the central corridor. Subject is hostile, moving towards the command center. Lethal force is authorized." "Wrong move," Deku muttered. He changed direction, heading for the barracks where Strucker's most loyal officers were stationed. He burst into their common area to find a dozen of them gearing up, their faces grim and fanatical. "For Hydra!" One of them bellowed, opening fire with his energy rifle. Deku was a whirlwind. He used smokescreen to fill the room with a thick, vision-obscuring cloud. The officers fired blindly into the gray haze. Deku, using danger sense to navigate the chaos, moved among them like a ghost. He used Black Whip to disarm them, snatching rifles from their hands. He used precise, low-percentage smashes to buckle their knees and shatter their armor plating. It was not a brawl. It was a surgical disassembly of a fighting force. One of the officers, seeing his men fall, grabbed a terrified-looking technician who had been caught in the crossfire, holding him as a human shield. "Stay back, you monster! Or this traitor dies." Deku froze at the edge of the smoke. This was the moment. The test. "There are no traitors here," Deku said, his voice echoing in the tense room. "Only people who were given a bad choice. Let him go. He is weak. He is expendable." "The Creed is dead," Deku interrupted. He took a single, deliberate step forward. The officer tensed, aiming his sidearm at the technician's head. Suddenly, a black tendril whipped out from the smoke, not at the officer, but at the pistol. It wrapped around the weapon and yanked, ripping it from his grasp. In the same motion, Deku used Fa Gene to cross the remaining distance in an instant, his hand grabbing the officer's shoulder. He didn't strike. He just squeezed. The man cried out and fell to his knees, his shoulder dislocated. Deku stood over him, then looked at the trembling technician, who stared back, his eyes wide with disbelief. He then turned his gaze to the other soldiers in the room, many of whom were just grunts who had been swept up in the chaos. They saw him standing over their defeated commander, having just saved one of their own. They saw the proof that his words from the interrogation weren't a lie. One of them, a young woman with a fresh scar on her cheek, slowly lowered her weapon and placed it on the floor. A second later, another followed suit. Then another. The tide was turning. The path to the command center was clear. The resistance had crumbled, not just from his power, but from his mercy. He arrived at the final set of blast doors to find Dr. Ryder waiting for him, a data pad in her hand. "Strucker is inside," she said, her voice even. "He returned early. He knows. He's initiated the Scorched Earth protocol. In 10 minutes, the facility's reactor will overload. He intends to die and take us all with him. Can you stop it?" Deku asked. "Only from the command center console. And he's sealed himself inside." She looked at the massive titanium doors. "They're impenetrable." "Nothing is impenetrable," Deku said, the green lightning around him intensifying. He placed his hands on the cold metal. "Stand back." He closed his eyes, drawing on the deepest wells of his power. He felt the vestiges, a chorus of encouragement. For those who come after, he channeled one for all not into his fists, but throughout his entire body, focusing the explosive force into a single, sustained push. One for all 80%. Full cowling, the doors groaned, the metal screeching in protest. A web of incandescent green cracks spread across the surface. With a final, deafening roar, the titanium buckled and ripped apart, the two halves peeling open like a steel husk. Deku stepped through the breach into the command center. The room was a vast amphitheater of technology. A panoramic screen dominated the far wall, showing feeds from all over the now chaotic base. In the center, on a raised dais, stood Baron von Strucker. He was no longer in his pristine suit. He was clad in a dark, powerful exoskeleton, and his right arm was encased in a massive, ornate gauntlet that glowed with a sickly red energy. "The Satan Claw. So, the rabid dog has slipped its leash," Strucker sneered, his voice booming through the room's speakers. "You think you have one? You have one nothing. Hydra is eternal. It is an idea, and it cannot be killed by a mere child." "Ideas can't be killed," Deku agreed, walking slowly towards him, his own green aura a stark contrast to Strucker's blood-red glow. "But they can be changed. They can evolve." "Heresy!" Strucker roared. He lunged, faster than his size should have allowed. The Satan Claw lashed out, firing a bolt of crimson energy. Deku dodged, the bolt sizzling past him and melting a hole in the wall behind. He closed the distance, aiming a kick at Strucker's leg. It connected with the exoskeleton with a loud clang, but the armor held. Strucker swung the massive claw, forcing Deku to backpedal. "You fight for the weak, the flawed, the herd," Strucker taunted, pressing his attack. "I fight for order. For strength. For a world cleansed of its own pathetic sentimentality." He was strong. Ruthless. The Satan Claw discharged energy blasts, created concussive waves, and its talons could shred steel. Deku was on the defensive, using his speed and agility to evade the onslaught. He was tired, his body screaming from the strain of the night's battle. He needed to end it. Now, he used smokescreen, filling the area around the dais with smoke. Strucker laughed. "You think hiding will save you?" He fired blindly into the cloud. But Deku wasn't hiding. He was preparing. Inside the smoke, he built up kinetic energy with Fa Gene, his muscles coiling like springs. Black Whip shot out, not at Strucker, but at the floor around him, anchoring Deku in place. He drew on the will of the vestiges, on All Might's smile, on Ares' terrified face, on his promise to be a hero. "You're right," Deku's voice called out from the smoke. "An idea can't be killed. But it can be replaced with a better one." He burst from the cloud. He wasn't aiming for Strucker's head or chest. He was aiming for the weapon. One for all, 60%. Detroit. Smash! His fist, glowing with an almost white-hot intensity, slammed directly into the center of the Satan Claw. It wasn't about overpowering the man. It was about destroying his symbol of power. There was a blinding flash of green and red light. A screech of tortured energy filled the room. The Satan Claw, Hydra's prized weapon, overloaded. It exploded in a shower of sparks and shrapnel, taking most of the exoskeleton's power with it. Strucker was thrown back, his arm mangled, his armor smoking and useless. He lay amidst the wreckage, defeated. Deku stood over him, breathing heavily, his arm throbbing. Dr. Ryder rushed past him to the main console, her fingers flying across the keypad. Reactor overload aborted, she announced, relief coloring her voice for the first time. Base system stabilizing. Deku looked down at the fallen Baron. The man glared back, his face a mask of pure, undiluted hatred. Kill me, Strucker spat. Finish it. Uphold your new creed, whatever it may be. Deku shook his head. He turned and walked to the command console, finding the switch for the base-wide intercom. He flipped it on. A soft chime echoed throughout the facility, followed by the sound of his own heavy breathing. In the barracks, in the med bay, in the mess halls, every soldier, every scientist, every technician, stopped and listened. This is the one you called the asset, Deku began, his voice raw but clear. Baron von Strucker has been defeated. His leadership is over. He paused, gathering his strength. For decades, this organization has lived by a single creed, cut off one head, and two more shall take its place. It was a promise of endless violence, a threat that your lives were expendable in a war that could never be won. It was a creed of fear. He took a deep breath, his voice swelling with a power that had nothing to do with one for all. From this day forward, that meaning changes. That promise is broken and reforged. From now on, our creed will be this. If a hero falls in the line of duty, two more will rise to take their place. If a community is in danger, 100 hands will reach out to help. If the world cries out for a shield, we will be that shield, with 1,000 heads, 1,000 hands, all working as one. He looked out at the main screen, at the sea of confused, frightened, and hopeful faces staring back at the cameras. The old Hydra is dead. Its purpose was to control humanity through fear. Our new purpose will be to protect it through sacrifice. This is no longer a sword to hold over the world's throat. Today, we begin forging it into a shield. He switched off the intercom. A profound silence fell over the command center, echoing throughout the entire facility. The coup was over. Dr. Ryder looked at him, her analytical gray eyes holding a new, unreadable emotion. Not admiration, not yet. But something like potential. A shield, she repeated softly, testing the word. An interesting hypothesis. Let's see if you can prove it. The serpent's head had been cut off. And in its place, a hero stood, ready to rebuild. The dawn of the new Hydra was not marked by a sunrise, but by the relentless, sterile glow of the command center's lights. The adrenaline of the coup had faded, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and the monumental, terrifying task of what came next. The facility, a sprawling subterranean fortress carved into the bedrock beneath a nondescript tract of upstate New York wilderness, was his. And its hundreds of inhabitants, soldiers, scientists, technicians, and janitors, were now his responsibility. The first order of business was triage. The command center became a makeshift courtroom, the panoramic screen displaying not battle schematics, but personnel files. Deku, seated in the command chair that still felt unnervingly large, worked alongside Dr. Ryder, who stood at his side, her datapad an extension of her will. She was the only one who truly knew the complex social and political ecosystem of the base. The Purge, she called it, with a clinical detachment that sent a shiver down Deku's spine. For her, it was a necessary cleansing of inefficient variables. For Deku, it was the first true test of his new creed. They began with Strucker's inner circle. The fanatical officers, the true believers who spoke of the Red Skull with quasi-religious reverence, were brought before them one by one. They were disarmed and escorted by guards who, just hours before, had been their subordinates. The dynamic of power had inverted so completely it was almost dizzying. A hulking officer named Commander Klaus Richter was the first. His face was a mask of contemptuous fury. "You are a plague," Richter spat, his eyes locked on Deku. "A foreign disease that has infected a noble body. You think these weak-willed fools will follow you? They will turn on you the moment a true leader emerges." Hydra is blood and soil, not weakness and mercy. Deku listened patiently, his hands steepled before him, a gesture he'd seen Principal Nizi use. It made him feel older, more authoritative than he felt. Commander, your service record is extensive. You are a brilliant tactician. Your skills could be invaluable. I would rather burn in hell than serve a heretic. Richter roared. That can be arranged, Ryder commented dryly from the side. Deku held up a hand. You have a choice, Commander. Renounce your old loyalties, pledge to a new purpose of protecting life, and your skills will be put to use. Or refuse, and you will be imprisoned. He leaned forward, his green eyes intense. I'm not offering you a third option. I am not Strucker. I will not execute a man for his beliefs, no matter how much I disagree with them. Richter laughed, a harsh, grating sound. Your mercy is your greatest weakness. It will be your undoing. He straightened up, his face set like granite. Heil Hydra. Take him to the detention block, Deku said, his voice quiet but firm. Cell block Gamma. The same cells they prepared for political prisoners. Ensure he has food, water, and medical attention. No exceptions. The guards, who had expected a summary execution, exchanged uncertain glances before complying. This single act sent a ripple through the facility. The new boss didn't kill his enemies. He jailed them. It was a language of power they understood, but with a grammar that was entirely alien, and so it went for hours. One by one, the fanatics were sorted from the pragmatists. The ones who preached hate and supremacy were imprisoned. But they were the minority. The vast majority of the base's personnel were like Leo, the young technician Deku had saved. They were people who had made a choice, often a poor one, out of desperation, ambition, or simple ignorance. They were offered a new contract. A mid-level logistics officer, a woman named Anya Sharma, stood before them, wringing her hands. I have a family, she stammered. I took this job because the pay was good, and they offered to cover my daughter's medical bills. I just managed supply chains. I didn't ask questions. You don't have to anymore, Deku said gently. From now on, you will know exactly what you are supplying and why. We are going to be a force for disaster relief and crisis containment. We will need medicine, food, temporary shelters, non-lethal capture technology. Can you manage that supply chain? Anya looked up, stunned. You mean, help people? That's the entire mission, Deku confirmed. Tears welled in her eyes. Yes, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Yes, I can do that. He was not just changing a mission statement. He was offering them absolution. He was giving them a chance to wash the red from their ledgers. For many, it was a lifeline they had never dreamed they would be offered. The most challenging conversation was with the security forces, the rank-and-file soldiers. Deku gathered their platoon leaders in the main training room, a cavernous space with padded floors and weapon racks that were now conspicuously empty. He stood before them not in his tattered costume, but in a simple black t-shirt and cargo pants provided by Ryder, his arms bandaged. He wanted them to see the person, not the asset. For your entire careers, he began, his voice echoing in the large room, you have been trained to be a sword. To be precise, to be lethal, to be feared. You are some of the best trained soldiers on this planet. But a sword has only one purpose, to cut. And eventually, all swords break. He paced before them, his gaze meeting each of theirs. I am asking you to become a shield. A shield's job is harder. It doesn't just have to be strong, it has to be smart. It has to know when to stand firm, when to absorb a blow, and when to redirect force. Its purpose is not to end a life, but to preserve one. It requires more discipline, more control, and more courage than pulling a trigger ever will. A grizzled veteran sergeant named Marcus Thorne, his face a roadmap of old scars, spoke up. With all due respect, sir, we're grunts. We follow orders. Strucker's orders were clear. What are yours going to be? My orders will be harder to follow, Deku admitted. Lethal force is now the absolute last resort, authorized only under the most extreme circumstances, and only with my direct approval. Your primary function is no longer assault, it's rescue. Your primary weapon is no longer your rifle, it's your training in containment, evacuation, and first aid. We will be retraining every single one of you. A murmur went through the crowd. This was heresy to their ingrained warrior ethos. You're turning us into glorified paramedics. Another soldier scoffed. No, Deku countered, his voice sharp. I'm turning you into guardians. Have you ever pulled a family from a burning building? Have you ever held the line against a flood to protect a town? Have you ever contained a chemical spill that could have poisoned thousands? That is a different kind of battle. A different kind of victory. One that builds instead of just destroys. I'm offering you the chance to go home at the end of the day knowing you saved lives, not just took them. He let the words hang in the air. He saw the conflict in their eyes, the clash between their old identity and the new one he was offering. He wasn't just giving orders, he was challenging their very definition of strength. It wouldn't happen overnight, but the seed was planted. With the personnel sorted, the next phase began, the rebranding. Deku knew the name Hydra was poison, a symbol of pure evil across the globe. To operate openly, they needed a new face. He convened a meeting with Dr. Ryder Anya Sharma from logistics, and a former propaganda artist named Elias Vance, a man whose job had been to design recruitment posters and motivational insignias. Vance was pale and nervous, expecting to be imprisoned for his role in creating the very symbols of their old ideology. We can't just erase the name, Ryder argued, ever the pragmatist. Our networks, our shell corporations, our supply lines, they are all tied to the Hydra designation. To excise it completely would be to lobotomize the organization. It would take years to rebuild, so we don't erase it, Deku said, an idea forming in his mind. We redefine it. We did it with the creed. We can do it with the name. He looked at Vance. Elias. You're an artist. Your job was to make Hydra's ideology appealing. Now your job is to create a symbol of hope. Deku sketched an idea on a datapad. He kept the core imagery, the multi-headed creature, but altered its meaning. Hydra won't be our name, he explained. It will be a project designation. An internal code name. Publicly, it will be an acronym. Something that reflects our new mission. They workshopped it for an hour. Anya suggested focusing on their defensive role. Elias proposed something that sounded proactive. It was Deku who finally pieced it together. HYDRA Heroic Yield Defense Reactive Alliance. It was clunky, a clear backronym, but it worked. It allowed them to keep the internal infrastructure while presenting a completely different face to the world. Now the logo, Deku said, turning to Vance. The skull has to go. It's a symbol of death. We are about life. Vance, his confidence growing, began to sketch. He took Deku's initial idea and refined it with an artist's flair. The skull was removed from the center of the logo. The tentacles, once menacing and grasping, were subtly reshaped. They were now thicker, more muscular, and instead of reaching out to crush, they curved inward, as if cradling or shielding the empty space where the skull used to be. The final design was powerful and ambiguous. To those who knew the old symbol, it was a clear perversion of the original. To outsiders, it looked like a stylized octopus or a kraken, perhaps representing a deep, powerful force from the ocean, rising to protect. It's good, Deku said, nodding in approval. It shows strength, but it's protective, not aggressive. This is our new shield. The transformation began to cascade through the facility. The old Hydra banners were taken down. The new logo was stenciled onto uniforms, vehicles, and corridor walls. It was a visual and psychological overhaul. The final, and most critical, part of the forging was the retraining. Deku, drawing on his memories of UA's grueling curriculum, personally designed the new training doctrine. He converted one of the massive vehicle bays into a new training ground, which the soldiers quickly nicknamed the cement mixer, a nod to both the concrete construction and the brutal workouts. The physical conditioning was even more intense than before. To save lives, you have to be the last one standing, Deku would tell them, running alongside them on their 5-mile subterranean jogs. Endurance is more important than aggression, but the real change was in the drills. Live fire ranges were replaced with incredibly complex disaster simulation zones. Deku and Ryder's science teams worked together to create them. One day, the soldiers would have to navigate a labyrinth of collapsing tunnels to rescue trapped civilians, robotic dummies with heat signatures and simulated vital signs. The next, they would be deployed into a chamber filled with a non-toxic but vision-obscuring gas, tasked with locating and sealing a simulated chemical leak while simultaneously evacuating personnel. Their weapons were completely overhauled. Ryder's labs, once focused on creating more efficient killing machines, were now tasked with innovation in non-lethal technology. Energy rifles were recalibrated to fire concussive blasts or electromagnetic pulses that could disable vehicles. New devices were prototyped: adhesive foam launchers for crowd control, deployable capture nets, and advanced medical tricorders that could diagnose injuries in the field. The soldiers had to master these tools, learning to think like rescue workers and SWAT officers instead of assassins. Deku led by example. He was in the thick of every training exercise. He demonstrated techniques, sparred with the soldiers, always holding back, but always pushing them to their limits, and participated in the simulations. During one particularly difficult exercise involving a simulated high-rise fire, Deku, using a combination of float and black whip, personally rescued a dozen dummies from the upper floors while his teams worked on the ground. His power was not just a symbol of leadership, it was an active teaching tool. He showed them what was possible. He earned their respect not through fear, but through sweat, expertise, and an unwavering commitment to the very principles he was teaching them. The gruff Sergeant Thorne, initially one of the most skeptical, became one of Deku's most ardent supporters after watching him spend 3 straight hours teaching a squad the most efficient way to clear debris from a collapsed structure without causing a secondary cave-in. "The kid's crazy," Thorne admitted to his platoon. "But he's the real deal. He works harder than any of us, and he could kill us all with a flick of his finger. Instead, he's teaching us how to save people. I don't get it, but I'll follow him." After a month of relentless, grueling transformation, the time for a final exam arrived. It came not from a schedule, but from a crackle on a shortwave radio receiver that was constantly scanning for emergency broadcasts. An alert from the New York State Police. A section of the Tappan Zee Bridge, a massive, vital artery over the Hudson River, had suffered a catastrophic structural failure during rush hour. A combination of metal fatigue and a multi-vehicle pileup had caused the 100-yard section of the upper deck to collapse onto the lower deck. Hundreds of cars were trapped, dozens had plummeted into the icy river, and the entire structure was groaning, threatening a complete pancake collapse. The official emergency services were overwhelmed, struggling to even reach the site through the gridlocked traffic. This was it. Not a simulation. Real lives hung in the balance. "This is our debut," Deku said, standing in the bustling command center. The new logo glowed on the panoramic screen behind him. "And we are going to ace it. Mobilize Strike Team Alpha and a medical auxiliary," he commanded, his voice ringing with authority. "Sergeant Thorne, your ground commander. Full non-lethal loadouts. Prioritize evacuation and structural support." Within minutes, the facility roared to life. 2 matte black, repurposed Hydra stealth carriers, sleek, VTOL aircraft that were previously used for covert insertions, lifted silently from their hidden launch bays. They were now emblazoned with the new, protective Kraken logo, and their holds were filled not with assassins, but with rescue specialists and advanced medical gear. They arrived on site in under 15 minutes, a ghost-like appearance that stunned the few police helicopters circling the periphery. The scene was worse than the reports. It was a twisted apocalypse of metal and fire. Cars dangled precariously from the edge of the broken roadway. The screams of the injured and terrified were a faint, desperate chorus on the wind. "Ryder, give me a structural analysis," Deku ordered from the command carrier, his eyes scanning the disaster zone. On his screen, a holographic model of the bridge appeared, glowing with red stress points. "The main suspension cables on the western pylon are failing." Her voice came back, cool and precise over the comms. "The entire section will go down in approximately 20 minutes if the load isn't stabilized. Catastrophic failure imminent. Thorne, your team has 15 minutes to get every living soul off that section," Deku commanded. "Move!" The carriers swooped in, deploying teams via fast rope onto the stable sections of the bridge. The newly christened Hydra operatives moved with the speed and precision of elite soldiers, but their actions were those of saviors. They used hydraulic jaws to pry open crushed vehicles, applied advanced foam sealants to stop fuel leaks, and set up triage stations for the wounded. They worked in perfect, disciplined harmony, a stark contrast to the unfolding chaos. But the most critical section, a bus teetering on the very edge of the collapse, was unreachable. The decking around it was too unstable. "Sir, we can't get to them," Thorne reported, his voice strained. "The whole platform is about to go." "I'm on it," Deku said. He stood at the open ramp of the carrier. "Get me as close as you can." The pilot, a former Hydra ace, maneuvered the large craft with incredible skill, holding it steady in the turbulent winds just 50 feet from the dangling bus. Deku took a deep breath. One for all, 45%. The green lightning flared to life. He leaped from the ramp. It was not a fall. It was a controlled descent, float feathering his momentum. He landed on the roof of the bus with a soft thud that barely rocked the vehicle. Inside, he could hear the panicked sobs of the passengers. Black whip! Massive tendrils of black energy erupted from his back, not as whips, but as thick, powerful cables. He fired them out, anchoring them to the strongest, most stable parts of the bridge structure far behind him. More tendrils wrapped around the bus itself, cradling it in a web of dark energy. With a deep, guttural roar of effort, he began to pull, physically holding the bus back from the brink, counteracting the pull of gravity. The muscles in his back and shoulders screamed. The strain was immense. He was a living anchor, the only thing standing between 30 people and a watery grave. On the ground, Sergeant Thorne and his team watched in stunned silence. This was the power their leader wielded, power he could have used to level cities, now being strained to its absolute limit to save a single busload of strangers. "What are you gawking at?" Thorne bellowed, shaking himself from his stupor. "You heard him. We have a job to do. Let's move." Galvanized by their leader's impossible feat of heroism, the teams redoubled their efforts. As Deku held the bus, they set up a zip line, evacuating the passengers one by one. The last person off was a little girl, no older than Eri, who looked back at the glowing green figure on the roof of the bus, her eyes wide with wonder. Once the bus was empty, Deku released his hold. The groaning vehicle finally succumbed to gravity, plunging into the Hudson below with a tremendous splash. He used Black Whip to swing back to the bridge, landing amongst the Hydra teams. The entire section was now clear of civilians. "All civilians evacuated from the critical zone, sir," Thorne reported, his voice filled with a new, profound respect. "Good," Deku panted, the green aura around him fading. "Now let's make sure no one else gets hurt." He looked at the failing suspension cables. He couldn't hold the whole bridge, but he could buy the engineers more time. He and a team of specialists spent the next hour using their advanced equipment and his power to secure the damaged pylon, reinforcing it with high-tensile cables and structural foam, stabilizing the bridge long enough for official crews to take over. By the time they pulled out, leaving the scene to the now-arriving state authorities, they had saved over 200 lives and prevented a multi-billion-dollar piece of infrastructure from complete collapse. They left behind a scene of stunned emergency workers and bewildered onlookers who had just witnessed a miracle. A mysterious, highly efficient organization with a strange Kraken logo had appeared out of nowhere, saved the day with technology and power beyond comprehension, and then vanished as silently as they had arrived. Back at the base, the mood was electric. The command center was filled with cheers as the last carrier touched down. The soldiers were exhausted, covered in grime and sweat, but their eyes shone with a light Deku had never seen in them before: pride. They weren't just following orders anymore. They believed. He stood on the command platform, looking at the exhausted but triumphant faces of his new alliance. They had been forged in the fires of a tyrant's ambition, and he had reforged them in the crucible of a heroic act. The sword had been beaten into a shield. Dr. Ryder stood beside him, her gaze fixed on the screen showing news reports already buzzing about the unidentified guardian angels of the Tappan Zee. "An impressive field test," she commented, her voice holding its usual clinical tone. But Deku could see a small, almost imperceptible smile on her lips. "Your hypothesis has been validated. For now." Deku smiled back, a genuine, tired smile. The path ahead was still long and uncertain, but for the first time since falling into this strange, new world, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel before. He felt like he was home.